This happened to me when I was about 12. My sister had this dog, a young Jack Russell, and since she was over at a friend's house, I figured I'd take him for a walk. It was around 8 p.m. in early May, and it was still light out, but it would be dark soon. I walked around the corner towards the local park. The dog tugged at his leash, and I made my way up the path and saw something odd. At first, I thought it was a bird. It looked a bit like a partridge, but it had a reddish-brown coloring and a greenish neck. I don't know why, but something about it made me curious. I was just a kid, so I decided to run after it. At first, it didn't move, just stood there. But when I got closer, it darted into the bushes. I hesitated for a moment, but being 12, I was determined to see what it was. I pushed through the bushes trying to follow the bird, but the thorns caught at my skin and clothes. The dog, who was still just a puppy, was pulling still. I had to hold him back because I was afraid that he might get stuck or hurt in the thorns. After a while, I gave up on the bird and started heading towards a nearby field. That's when I started hearing strange noises from the bushes. Not the usual black crow or chickadee noises, but something else. It sounded like a bird, but not a bird that I had heard before. It was high-pitched, almost a whistle. I thought someone was messing around and assumed it to be some kind of a prank. I'd heard people using those foam whistle things to mimic bird calls, so I figured that's all it was. But then the noise changed. It wasn't bird sounds anymore, and it had changed to monkey noises now. The way the noise shifted, it was unmistakably a human trying to sound like a monkey, and I didn't live in an area where wild monkeys were a thing. I stopped walking for a moment and looked around, but all I could see were bushes. I started to move towards the exit of the park. The dog was tugging harder now, as if it could sense something was wrong. That's when I noticed somebody standing in the bushes, partially hidden. They were wearing a blue coat, and I could barely make out his face, but there was something about the way he stood there, just watching me, that made me freeze. I couldn't tell if it was a man or someone else, but I knew I didn't want to find out. I thought I might have imagined it, so I told myself to calm down and I kept walking, but the dog was acting weird. He started tugging harder and whining and barking, but not his usual playful bark. It was frantic, almost desperate. I took his collar to try to calm him down, but he bit at it like he was trying to get away from me, which was unlike him. When I let go of the leash for a second, he lunged at me, trying to bite my hand. Not a playful nip, but like he was genuinely trying to hurt me. It didn't break my skin, but it scared me. I don't know what was going on with him, but it felt wrong. At that point, I was freaked out enough that I decided it was time to leave. I started walking quickly towards the path that led out of the park, the dog pulling me faster. Just as I turned back to head for the exit, I looked over my shoulder and I saw the person in the blue coat again behind me. I began speed walking towards the exit of the park, but that's when I saw another person coming towards me from the other side of the park. He was wearing a bright red coat, and he was moving fast, way too fast for someone just out for a walk. I didn't think, I just ran. I ran as fast as I could, having to find an exit through the wooded tree area of the park, since the other people were blocking my path. I didn't stop until I was safely at my back door. When I got inside, I locked the door and ran up from my bedroom. I was shaking by then, but I felt a little safer in the house. I needed to make sure I was okay, so I peeked out of my window just to see if anybody was out there. When I looked out of the window, I saw the people in the red and blue coat walking down the street together now. They were scanning yards and staring for long periods of time into people's windows and backyards as they walked by. I think they were looking to see where I lived, but thankfully, I slipped in through the back door and they had no idea which house I lived in. I shut the curtain to my room, and I didn't dare look outside again as they'd be out in front of my house soon. I've never felt that scared again, and I never went back to that park alone after dark. Often, I enjoy walking my dog at nighttime. This is due to the fact that my dog is harder to walk when people are around with their own dogs. So we tend to walk around parks in the area when they've become somewhat secluded. Personally, being a smaller guy, I don't think I'm an intimidating figure. However, my 120-pound dog named Loki could be somewhat considered threatening to most. I figured his size would be used as a deterrent for anybody looking to cause trouble at night, but I was wrong. On one specific night, I had an encounter that reminds me why I'm so reluctant to walk around in the dark now. The park is one that I've been to a couple of times and is usually secluded around 7 p.m. and later. Aside from a couple of joggers or very few other dog walkers, not many people walk on the same path I take. I also like to put in my headphones and listen to music while I walk, but on this specific night, I chose not to wear them since my phone was on low battery and I wanted to preserve it as long as I could. Anyways, the walk was going as usual. Loki did his business and we continued on our usual path. About midway through the walk, I realized that it had started to get really dark. Since he was almost done with his business, I decided to cut the walk somewhat short, and we took a shortcut that kind of led us off the path. This path had a bunch of trees surrounding the area, and there were still leaves on the branches. As we walked, I got a weird feeling as if I were being watched. I have pretty bad anxiety sometimes, but since I knew the town was safe, I knew that nothing was going to happen. But still, I could not shake off the feeling that I was being watched. I peered back to see if anybody had been following me out of anxiety, and every time, no one was there. In fact, no one was anywhere, as the whole shortcut was essentially secluded. Suddenly, Loki stopped walking and also looked back. One thing I failed to mention is that Loki is a big coward. I noticed his tail was tucked between his legs, which is a telltale sign that a dog is afraid. I was also curious and a bit nervous, but I surely did not want to find out what he heard or noticed. I just wanted to get home fast. I pulled a little and he began to walk, but every now and then I'd see him peer back. After maybe a minute or so of walking, he stopped again, and this time he began to growl. I used my phone's flashlight to see what he was growling at. All I could see was just trees though, and I assumed what he heard was probably some kind of a small animal. Once again, I turned around and kept walking. He continued to peer back once in a while still, but this time I noticed it was a lot more frequent. Finally, I heard what appeared to be actual footsteps and branches breaking. There's absolutely no way a small animal could have produced a sound like that. Loki turned around quick, and still with his tail tucked, he began to growl and bark at a man in his early 50s who had come out of the woods. He was dressed in dirty clothing, his hair was long and graying. He had one hand in his pocket, and he said to me, "Hey, nice dog, can I pet it?" The man got closer and emerged from the trees. Loki instantly got bad vibes, and he ran behind me and started to bark at the man. I stated that it probably wasn't a good idea since Loki was acting so weird, and I didn't want to scare him more. I felt extremely uncomfortable as the man appeared to get closer and closer. I didn't know why this guy couldn't take no for an answer. I mean, I usually don't allow people to pet Loki unless he comes up to them first. If he's scared of you, then I usually don't want to freak him out by letting him be pet by a stranger. This is especially the case when it's a stranger who came out of the woods behind a few trees. I told the man I was sorry and that I didn't want him to get bit, so I began walking away. This seemed to anger the man. This time, I sped walked as my fight or flight instincts began to take over. He followed us and kept muttering curses to himself. I don't know if this man was under the influence of something, but he did not let up. He began to match my speed, almost as if he was trying to catch up to us. Loki and I both looked at this as a sign to start sprinting a bit. I remember the spine-tingling feeling of hearing the man's footsteps rapidly increasing behind me as we ran away. For a man of his stature, he was quite fast. I also realized that his intentions may not have been just to pet my dog. No one reasonably would go that far just to pet a dog that clearly wanted nothing to do with them. I looked behind me as he was in pursuit, maybe about 10 feet behind us. I'll never forget the look in his eyes. I've never had anyone look at me like that. My instincts told me that he definitely had sinister intent. Finally, the path led us to the park exit and into the busier streets, and the man stopped chasing me at the edge of the woods. I lived about 10 minutes away from the park and made sure that no one was following me and stayed on populated streets. I made a police report, since after all, this guy seemed to have been quite suspicious, and who knows what his true intentions were. Had his target been somebody who couldn't protect themselves or run away, what could he have done? I also often ask myself what might have happened if I had worn my headphones that night and didn't hear him at all. Ever since, I haven't walked Loki in that park. I've also made it a habit of mine to walk on livelier streets at night. I had an experience recently that I haven't been able to shake. I was dog sitting for my boyfriend while he was away on a trip. My boyfriend's home is in a semi-remote area at the bottom of a hill at the back of a few acres of property. He's right next to the highway, and across the highway is a small rural neighborhood. It's an odd community, as people frequently keep to themselves, and there are lots of abandoned, rundown homes right next to the very well-kept homes. It was in this neighborhood that I had agreed to watch my boyfriend's property and his dog named Hennessy. Hennessy is a 115-pound bulldog and Labrador mix. He's basically all muscles, and ever since my boyfriend and I began dating, he's become very protective of me and my own dog, Lottie. My dog, Lottie, is very much the opposite of Hennessy, being a 57-pound poodle mix. When I was dog sitting, I also brought my own dog over to my boyfriend's house. I cannot walk Hennessy and Lottie at the same time because of how much Hennessy pulls, so I usually walk Lottie alone and then go back to Hennessy to walk him alone. We do about 30 minutes of walking each, and I like to take Hennessy after Lottie at night because I feel safer with him as it gets later. One night while I was dog sitting, I was about halfway through my walk with Lottie when I got this really weird feeling that I was being watched. I looked around to see about 30 feet or so back, there was a tall man in a hoodie standing next to an older, run-down home. I instantly thought the hoodie was weird. It didn't get colder than 87 degrees in the evening where we were, especially when the sun was still setting like it was at the time. As we walked, the sun continued to set, and the streets began to slowly get darker. I would glance back from time to time and notice that the man was keeping pace with me. Finally, we reached the highway, and I crossed right before a car came speeding past, hoping to slow the guy down. This put some distance between us now, but it didn't stop him from continuing to follow me. I walked as fast as I could to the house, now being able to hear his footsteps on the gravel. I made it back inside the house, slammed and locked the door, hoping that was the end of it. But it was not. Moments after I'd shut and locked the door, I felt somebody trying to open it. The dogs heard this too and started barking, because they always do when someone's at the door. There's no peephole on the door, but I can talk to whoever's on the other side since it's a thin door. So I yelled out and asked who was there. Through the barking, I heard a man's voice say, "I love your dog. Can I meet it?" I yelled back no through the door and asked him to please go away. He started trying the door handle again, this time pushing up against the door. By that point, my dogs could tell something was wrong. The hair on the back of Hennessy's neck was standing up, and he gnashed his teeth while growling. At that moment, I don't know why I made this decision, and I probably shouldn't have, but it worked out. I threw Lottie into the bathroom behind me and grabbed Hennessy by the collar, keeping him close to the door with me. I unlocked the door and opened it just wide enough that Hennessy could go about halfway out. He was going crazy at that point, and my hands started to hurt from holding him back. I heard his teeth clack as he ferociously chomped towards the man. This man was clearly not expecting a big dog, since I had taken a small dainty one on a walk. He stumbled back, almost falling over as he scrambled away. He didn't even look at me, and instead booked it up the hill as fast as he could and out of sight. I managed to pull Hennessy back inside, and I called the cops to tell them what had happened. I never got a good look at the guy, but they basically told me there wasn't anything they could really do. I don't know why the man didn't get the hint when I had two dogs barking inside, but my assumption is that he didn't really realize he was hearing two barks. Maybe he assumed if I had two dogs, they would both be like my poofy poodle. Looking back, I probably should have just called the cops and kept my door closed. However, I hope that he never comes back now thanks to Hennessy. It was the summer of my senior year in high school, and I was living in a small town, working and going to school. One of my good friends, Emma, asked if I would be interested in house and dog sitting for her family for a week. They were going up to Northern California to visit some relatives. I was going to get paid, and since I didn't have anything else planned, I agreed. The house was only about 10 to 15 minutes from mine, so it wasn't really an inconvenience. Emma's family had 3 dogs, and I'd been over to her house multiple times, so I knew the dogs well, and I figured it would be a relaxing week. The first couple of days went smoothly. Nothing weird happened. I went to work every day, then came back to their house to take care of the dogs, fed them, let them outside, and so on. Then, on the 3rd day, I worked a late shift, from 1 to 9 p.m. After work, I drove over to Emma's house like usual. It was already dark by the time I pulled into their driveway. As I turned in, I saw something that immediately shocked me. The 3 dogs were in the street just wandering around near the driveway. The garage door was wide open, and the front door was also open. My first thought was that I had forgotten to close the garage door when I left, and thankfully all the dogs were there. I parked in the driveway and jumped out of my car. The dogs looked up at me, wagging their tails, and I quickly got them all back into the house. I shut the front door behind me and locked it. Then I went to the garage door, which was still open, and shut that too. The dogs were acting completely normal also. As I went through the house, I noticed all the doors were open, and I mean every single one. The side door to the kitchen, the back door, and even all the doors upstairs to bedrooms and such. Every single window was also wide open. That's when I realized that this wasn't from me absent-mindedly forgetting to close the front door and garage door before I left. I called the police. I told them that I wasn't sure what was going on, but all the doors had been left open and it seemed weird. When the officers arrived, they searched the house room by room, but found nothing out of place. Later that week, on the last day that I was house sitting for Emma's family, I came back from work again to find the exact same scenario. All the doors and windows in the house were wide open. I called the cops once again, and again they didn't find anybody inside. I was very scared now, especially after having it happen again. So I took care of the dogs and left for the night, not wanting to sleep in the house. Emma's family came back the next day, and for the rest of the time that they lived there until moving out a couple of years later, they never had anything like that happen to them. This happened to me a couple of years ago when my husband and I were living in a townhouse in a pretty decent area. My husband was working that night, and it was an unusually warm night for mid-March, so I took advantage. I decided to take our 80-pound Siberian Husky mixed dog on a quick walk around the neighborhood near our complex. We got to the end of the street that leads into the complex we live in, and across the street is a gas station. As the dog Luke stopped to relieve himself, I saw there was a guy across the street at the gas station with a case of beer in his hands. I had my phone out texting a friend, and looked back up to notice that the guy was near the stop sign, also relieving himself. I felt really awkward and instantly put my phone away and led Luke down the street on our path. At the point this guy noticed us, he crossed the street to where Luke and I had just been. I heard him walking a few feet behind me. After about 10 seconds, I heard the guy's steps getting closer. Luke realized that there was somebody behind us and he stopped in his tracks. I was glad that he was aware of our surroundings, but I still wanted him to keep moving and get away from this guy. The guy was clearly drunk, and I just had a bad feeling about him. The man finally caught up, so I tightened my grip on Luke's leash. I pulled him closer to me as I stepped into the grass to allow the guy to pass us. However, instead of passing us, the man decided to stop even with us on the sidewalk. He stopped and just stared at me for a minute, long enough for me to smell the cigarettes and booze coming from him, and also to notice that he was probably in his mid to late 20s with dark hair and that he was just dirty. He smiled and then finally seemed to notice Luke. He then proceeded to ask me if he could pet my dog, and before I could even give him an answer, he leaned down to start petting Luke's head. Luke didn't like that and jumped at him as a warning, and the guy backed up while he chuckled. The man then started asking questions like what my name was and where I lived. Obviously, I gave him a fake name and said that I was just in town for the week. The man then made a sudden step towards me. I've never heard our dog growl in the 5 years that we've had him, but the sound that came from my dog sounded like something from nightmares. Luke had put himself completely between me and the guy while snapping at him. This freaked the dude out so much that he stumbled backwards, nearly dropping his beer. He resorted to saying, "Have a good night, cutie," and then stumbled down the road. Our dog is the sweetest and most gentle creature I've ever met, and to have him growl and react like he did, it gave me a very bad feeling about the man.